Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Aloy, a new free 5-star character that everyone got in their mail and that PlayStation players had access to last patch. Since she is free, I'm getting asked a lot how good she is, and so we're going to cover that in this video, talk about her playstyle, what teams she can fit, how she should be used, what her strengths and weaknesses are, and also compare her to other cryo characters and see just how good she is and whether or not she's viable. So without further ado, I want to cover how strong this character is in this video. Before I begin, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get into it. So regarding Aloy, there's a couple of things that you should know. First of all, we don't have access to her constellations yet. Like, she doesn't really have constellations, as you can see. So that is one downside. She's a character who doesn't have constellations right now, which is definitely unfortunate and a downside. With that out of the way, let's talk about Aloy's talents and her playstyle to start off this video. Her elemental skill is a very unique ability that will throw a bomb and then leave some little bombs on the ground. The first, it will like explode, do some cryo damage, and then there's going to be mini bombs on the ground that will explode when enemies walk into them. Anytime an enemy walks into the bomb, Aloy will gain a coil stack, and she can gain one of those every 0.1 seconds, and when she gains 4 of them, she will infuse her auto attacks with cryo. This can make her a cryo auto attacker if enemies do walk into them, and there are some ways to make it easier, like using characters like Sucrose or Anemo units in general to displace enemies, if you do want to manage to convert her damage to cryo damage. The one thing I want to say with these stacks is that they can be annoying to proc, since if you're not fighting too many enemies, they might not walk into 4 of them. However, as I mentioned, running Anemo characters with this skill can be nice, although unfortunately some abilities like Venti's Burst will not suck up these bombs. Overall though, this ability's strength is actually how many particles it generates. As you guys can see, it generates a ton of cryo particles on every hit, usually 5 cryo particles with a chance of it being 4 as well, which is just an absolutely huge amount. And you can also pair it with a weapon like Sacrificial Bow or Favonius to generate even more energy. Regarding this ability's damage, the first hit is okay, but overall the chill water bomblets don't do that much, and then it also will increase your normal attack damage if you are running Aloy as a main DPS, which we'll cover a bit later, but isn't as recommended as running her as a support. The reason for that is because not only are the coil stacks kind of difficult to proc, but even if you can manage to proc them by pairing her with something like an Anemo character, the damage she'll be dealing as an on-field auto attacker is not as high as other DPSs, even for a free-to-play character, to where I mainly recommend running her as a support. In fact, I believe Aloy's strength and her main role is to be a cryo battery, generating a lot of particles with her skill, while fitting some freeze teams that want a cryo support, since she is a free-to-play option that anyone can use. And her burst, which as you guys can see, does a pretty okay amount of damage. Honestly, the scaling for an ability is actually pretty high. 500% at level 6, when you compare it to other characters' abilities, is actually very high, with only a 12-second cooldown and a very low energy cost of 40, allowing you to spam this without needing too much energy recharge. Overall, as a character, I believe Aloy's biggest strengths are that she is a cryo character, and since cryo is so meta, being able to apply cryo, fit into freeze teams, give you cryo particles, and have a fast, low energy cost burst that can deal okay amount of damage, can make her at least viable as a free-to-play option. That being said, she doesn't provide you as much utility as some other cryo characters like Diona, who will give you a similar amount of particles, while also providing you with a shield and some healing. And when you compare her damage, which mainly comes from her burst, to some other cryo characters with strong bursts, like for example Chongyun, whose burst will hit 3 times or 4 times if you have a 6 constellation, does have a much higher scaling. Keep in mind, right now my talent level is 9, but I'll put the number for a talent level 6 Chongyun. This number multiplied by 3 or 4 will typically be higher than Aloy's, and on top of that, Chongyun also has some other strengths like infusing your auto attacks with cryo, having an attack speed passive that can be pretty nice, and actually access to constellations, notably his second one that decreases your cooldown of your party members. Now again, this is why I believe her biggest strength is that she is free to play and accessible to everyone. Her cryo batterying honestly isn't that bad. The particles her skill generates are pretty high, although her damage can be underwhelming unless you are like melting her burst. Now one of Aloy's passive talents is actually pretty nice that I haven't mentioned so far, is that she can actually increase her attack but also her party members attack with the coil effect on her skill. So when you do proc that coil when enemies step on those bombs, or when your skill hits an opponent, because that also procs coil, her attack will be increased by 16%, and other party members will gain 8% attack for 10 seconds, which is honestly a pretty okay passive. Her second passive, however, only applies when she's in the rushing ice state, which is where enemies have stepped on 4 of those bombs, and then she will gain more cryo damage to herself, which is more of a niche passive, but I thought I should mention it. Also, in case you're wondering about her talent priority, typically you want to max your burst first, because it's the most damage, and then your skill, and ignore your normal attacks as a support. but if you are DPSing, then you can focus on your normal attacks. So that being said, how good is Aloy? And when can she be used? Well, regarding her teams, as I mentioned, I believe she's viable in freeze teams, like the one you're currently seeing, where you can pair her with Ganyu, Mona, and Venti, and then use Aloy as the last slot. Typically, you'd run Diona, but Aloy can give you more particles with every cast of her skill, and run a bow like Sacrificial or Favonius, and also have a higher damage dealing burst than someone like Diona. So you are gaining damage by running Aloy. However, you are losing out on the shields and the healing, which are more or less needed. It depends what you're doing, since obviously freeze teams are perma-freezing enemies to where you don't always need a healer, but it can be nice against certain enemies. Now, other than just freeze teams, which is what I recommend the most, there are some other teams that Aloy can be placed in where she is a viable free-to-play option. For example, when you look at the Xiangling national team, which is Xiangling, Xingqiu, and Bennett, the last character is a flex slot. The best options, and I want to be clear, are usually characters like Kazuha or Sucrose, so I do recommend those two over Aloy. However, some crowd characters can be viable as the fourth slot. For example, Chongyun and even Aloy can work here as an on-field auto attacker, applying Xingqiu's rain swords while your Xiangling's Pyronado spinning around her, allowing your Xiangling to proc those reactions non-stop, and your Aloy can even melt her burst since you are running pyro characters with her. This means that Aloy can be a viable option right here, can be a viable fourth slot without being meta defining, obviously, since someone like Sucrose or Kazuha will outshine her. So her damage isn't high enough to be like a must build, but again, her strength does come in the fact that she is a free to play option. I do, however, recommend mainly using her in some freeze comps, especially when you consider pairing her with someone like Venti, Ganyu, and Mona, who can make for a very good quick swap team. Regarding using her as just a cryo support for non-freeze teams, right, where you are running someone like Razor, someone like Eula who wants a cryo support, for those teams I would recommend running Diona instead. Sure, Aloy can be viable if you just like her, but someone like Diona will provide you with also the healer role, which those characters will need, and having a shield for those characters is also very nice. And even other crowd characters like Rosaria will just give you, sure, maybe less particles, but just way more damage and way more utility with, like, let's say Rosaria's crit rate passive that just buffs your hyper carry like Eula a significant amount. But I don't recommend running this character as a main DPS because she's a lot more efficient as a support, because her scalings, even with her skill buffing her normal attacks and making them cryo, really isn't as high as most other DPS characters, to where I do recommend running her as a support. And I have seen people run her for like quick swap reverse melting, right, where you pair her, for example, in the team comp I usually use, which is Kaya, if I can find him, Kaya, Rosaria, Xiangling, Bennett. People have replaced one of the two with Aloy, but again, she isn't as powerful just from a burst DPS standpoint as these other crowd characters. And so that's why I recommend her more for like freeze teams, or basically everything else I mentioned in this video over running her in a team comp like this from a purely meta perspective. Now, regarding how to build this character, I do want to say that there's a few different builds. I highly recommend running her as a support, giving her Sacrificial or Favonius Warbow. Yes, if you want to increase her damage, something like Stringless will do that. If you want to melt her burst or whatever. And as a main DPS, obviously auto attacking options, or even Windbloom's Ode as like a burst support, or when you want to maximize your Aloy's damage can be better. But typically I do recommend either Favonius Warbow or Sacrificial Bow as a support, because this will give you not only enough energy recharge to where you will no longer need any more on your artifacts, since Sacrificial Bow and Favonius both gain a ton of ER at level 90 if you do level it, to where it's all the energy recharge you need for a 40 cost burst, with an effect that's just very nice. The Favonius Warbow generating white particles, and the Sacrificial Bow resetting your elemental skill cooldown, which is very long, allowing you to cast it again, generating another set of 5 particles for a total of 10, which is absolutely amazing. Sacrificial Bow is my preferred one, but if you are low refinement, it can be very annoying, and I do think Sacrificial and Favonius are both very similar in strength. And regarding the artifacts you want, there's actually 2 main builds, or 2 or 3, I guess. I'll cover all of them. As a support, I do want to say that Aloy can be a very good user of the Noblesse Oblige 4-piece. If you want to use her to buff your team, since her burst is low energy cost, pretty low cooldown, honestly, of only 12 seconds, you can actually maintain the Noblesse Oblige 4-pieces uptime with ease, since this does buff your entire team's attack percent by 20% for 12 seconds whenever you use your burst. On top of that, the 2-piece will also increase your burst damage by 20%, making it the go-to set as a pure support. When you want to buff your hyper carries or someone like Ganyu who'll just be dealing massive amounts of damage, running the 4-piece Noblesse on Aloy is the way to go. In a freeze team, if you want your Aloy to be dealing more damage though, something like the Blizzard Slayer can be absolutely amazing, since this is just a no-brainer set for freeze teams, giving you 15% crowd damage and 40% crit rate against frozen enemies. This will be the way to maximize your Aloy's damage, whereas Noblesse Oblige is better for your team's damage when you run her as a pure support. So obviously which set you go for does depend on playstyle. I also want to mention, if you want to run her for damage and you don't have 4 Blizzard or you're not freezing, 2 Noblesse with 2 Blizzard Strayer can be good too, or even the 4 Emblem set to maximize your burst, although you typically don't need that much energy recharge. For your artifact stats, since you're running energy recharge on your weapon typically as a support, you don't really need any more energy recharge on your artifacts, to where attack percent sands, cryo damage goblet, and crit circlet are the way to go. And if you are running Blizzard Strayer, do prioritize crit damage for your circlet over crit rate, since you are getting a lot of crit rate through your Blizzard Strayer passive, and also with like cryo resonance if you do choose to run her with another cryo character. So overall as a character, Aloy or Aloy, I'm still not sure how to pronounce it, is in a pretty weird spot right now. On one hand, she generates you a lot of particles with her skill, 5 every time, although the cooldown is, as I showed earlier in the video, 20 seconds, which is pretty long. The particles it gives you, especially when paired with something like Sacrificial or Favonius Warbow, can be very good if you need a cryo battery. From a meta perspective, she is outshined by someone like Diona if you also need a healer, but can be a replacement to her if you don't have her, or if you want more damage as a battery if you don't need the healing or the shield. She also has a pretty high scaling on her burst, although it will give you less overall damage than someone like a Rosaria or even a Kaya, to where if you're purely looking for damage, I recommend those other characters over her, but she will generate you, as I mentioned, more particles and is a purely free-to-play option, to where she does have some strengths, as well as obviously being a good Noblesse user and buffing your team's attack by a little percent, 8% plus the 4 Noblesse. And when you pair that with being viable in some freeze teams like the Morgana comp that we saw earlier, which does have 3 5-stars in it, so it's a pretty expensive team to fit a free-to-play unit into, but it is a viable one, making Aloy have a niche without being meta. So to answer the question, is she good? Well, as a free-to-play battery, she's okay, but in a meta perspective, she's not that great. She's not the best unit, so definitely not someone who I think is like top tier or anything by any means. She's not a character that I'm too passionate about though, and while her burst can hit big numbers like in this meme team I used against the Pyro Plant, I do think her main role is as a pure support. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope if you like Aloy that you find her enjoyable, you can, get fun out of her, value out of her, all that. And with that being said, I'm gonna end it here. I want to go work on my Beto guide and maybe a new Abyss guide if the new Abyss is hard. We'll see. It's coming out literally tomorrow for me, and I will be streaming it live, so link in the description if you want to catch that. Feel free to join the Discord if you're new and want some help. If you have any questions, be sure to leave a comment because I do read most of them. There will be also a pinned comment if there's anything I want to add in the future. And with that being said, I hope this short video was helpful. Feel free to sub if you're new, and with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.